They didn't fight for glory. They fought because they had to. Picture a field soaked in blood, horses screaming, men slipping in the mud, not from rain, but from the crushed remains of those who fell before them. Medieval battles weren't choreographed duels or grand pageantry. They were survival contests, dirty, desperate, and system-shattering. It wasn't just about who had the bigger army. It was who could feed that army, who had the right terrain, who had enough arrows, who could survive one more freezing night without dysentery wiping out half the camp. Behind every clash of steel was a fragile web of logistics, food supplies, morale, and weather, all on the brink of failure. We tend to romanticize the past. Knights, banners, honor. But medieval warfare was where empires stumbled, where kings were broken, and where the collapse of a single grain line could mean the fall of a dynasty. And here's the real reason these battles still matter. They show us what happens when systems stretch too thin, when assumptions collapse, when overconfidence meets mud. Because if you think our world is more stable, ask yourself this: what would happen if the food trucks stopped tomorrow? The past isn't just behind us, it's a mirror. And sometimes that mirror is cracked and covered in blood. Let's walk into it, one battlefield at a time. When arrows changed the world, it was just one day, a few hours, but it ended an entire world. October 14th, 1066, the fields near Hastings turned into a stage for one of the most consequential battles in Western history. On one side stood King Harold Godwinson, the last of the Anglo-Saxon rulers. On the other, Duke William of Normandy, ambitious, calculating, and backed by papal approval and a war machine powered by French feudalism. Harold's men held the high ground, a powerful defensive ridge, shield wall tight, morale high. They'd just marched hundreds of miles after defeating a Viking invasion in the north, exhausted but defiant. William's forces attacked uphill again and again and were repelled. The line held until it didn't. What cracked it wasn't brute force, it was psychology. The Normans feigned retreat, triggering the English to break formation and chase. That one move flipped the battle. The shield wall collapsed, arrows rained down, and somewhere in the chaos, a single arrow, perhaps fired at random, struck King Harold in the eye. That moment ended the Anglo-Saxon era. But the real impact was systemic. Norman rule didn't just replace a king, it rewired England. French became the language of the elite. Castles spread across the landscape like stone anchors. Land ownership changed. Taxation systems were restructured. Even the food changed. Spices, wine, olive oil. One arrow pierced a king and rewrote a culture. This wasn't a simple invasion. It was a total operating system upgrade, violent, abrupt, and irreversible. It forces us to ask, how fragile is a culture? How quickly can everything familiar, language, law, landscape, be overwritten? In Hastings, the answer was just one battle, and far from over. Our next battlefield shows what happens when mobility meets mathematics and horses become machines of precision death. The Mongol storm, Kalka River, 1223. It began with a whisper on the steppe and ended with a massacre by a river. In 1223, at the banks of the Kalka River, a coalition of Rus princes and Kipchak allies faced a Mongol force unlike anything Europe had seen. The Rus outnumbered them. They had heavy infantry, noble cavalry, and pride. But the Mongols had something else. Systems thinking on horseback. They weren't just warriors, they were mobile logisticians. Their army operated like a decentralized network, fast-moving units, independent yet coordinated through flag signals, horns, and an unbreakable chain of loyalty. They scouted weeks ahead, knew the terrain, spread misinformation, and waited. When the Rus charged, the Mongols retreated, not in panic, but by design. They lured their enemy across open ground over days of pursuit, draining their strength. Then, with brutal timing, they turned and surrounded them. The result? A complete collapse. Thousands were killed. Captured princes were executed beneath banquet boards, crushed alive, while Mongol generals feasted above them. But Kalka River wasn't just a slaughter. It was a systems test. A rigid, hierarchical force buckled under the weight of a fluid, responsive machine. The Mongols didn't win by size. They won by strategy, information, and speed. Compare that to modern life. Are we more like the Mongols, mobile, adaptive, decentralized? Or are we like the Rus princes, slow, tradition-bound, and vulnerable to collapse? At Kalka, the lesson was clear. Flexibility outlives formality. And next, we'll see how even the most elite forces, armored, noble, and proud, can be drowned in the mud by peasants with bows and patience.
Agincourt, 1415. Mud, arrows, and the death of chivalry. It was supposed to be a slaughter, but not the way it turned out. On a cold October morning in 1415, Henry V's exhausted, half-starved English army faced off against a vastly superior French force. Thousands of French knights in gleaming armor, mounted and confident, prepared for what they believed would be a swift and glorious charge. It was chivalry's finest hour, until it wasn't. The battlefield was narrow, hemmed in by thick woods. Days of rain had turned the soil to a sucking mire. But the French charged anyway, believing their status, armor, and numbers would carry them through. They didn't expect the mud, they didn't expect the bottleneck, and they didn't expect thousands of low-born English longbowmen planted behind sharpened stakes, calmly firing volley after volley into the chaos. Armor became a coffin. Horses fell, trapping riders beneath them. The weight of their own men crushed the front line. Those who made it across found themselves too exhausted to fight. And then came the knives. The English archers, not noble knights, not trained swordsmen, stormed the field with hatchets and mallets. They finished what the arrows started. The flower of French nobility was cut down by peasants wielding farm tools. Agincourt wasn't just a military victory. It was a cultural earthquake. The myth of aristocratic invincibility shattered. In one muddy field, the class system bled. This was the death of chivalry, not in honor, but in horror. And it asks a timeless question. What happens when the elite stop understanding the terrain they rule? When the system collapses under its own assumption? Next, we'll travel to the final days of an empire behind walls thought to be unbreakable, and witness how innovation, timing, and desperation brought down a 1,000-year legacy. The Siege of Constantinople, 1453. For 1,000 years, Constantinople stood like a stone promise that some cities never fall. Its walls were legendary, massive, layered, engineered to withstand the wrath of centuries. Invaders had tried and failed for generations. To the Christian world, it was the last beacon of the Roman Empire, untouchable, eternal.
But on May 29, 1453, that illusion ended. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old, brought something previous armies had not: gunpowder and patience. His forces surrounded the city from land and sea, cutting off supplies and hope. Day by day, massive cannons pounded the walls, shaking foundations not just of stone, but of belief. Inside, morale cracked faster than masonry. Food dwindled. Religious leaders preached unity, but divisions deepened. The defenders believed heaven would intervene. It didn't. When the final breach came, it was swift. Ottoman troops surged through the shattered gates. What followed wasn't just conquest, it was collapse. Churches were turned to mosques, libraries burned. A millennium of continuity ended in hours. But this wasn't just the fall of a city. It was the triumph of innovation over tradition. Gunpowder made a mockery of medieval walls. Naval tactics and psychological warfare replaced brute force. The myth of invincibility died with the last Byzantine emperor, sword in hand, lost in the crowd. And it leaves us with a brutal truth. No system is too big to fall. No wall too thick. No legacy too sacred. Empires aren't eternal. They're engineered, and every structure, no matter how mighty, has a point of failure. Next, we head north to a vast forest where Crusader steel met Slavic resilience. There, another kind of power shifted, not from walls, but from ideology. Battle of Grunwald, 1410, in the heart of Eastern Europe, on a wide open field beneath a boiling summer sun, one of the largest battles of the medieval world unfolded, and most people have never heard of it. Grunwald wasn't just swords and banners. It was a collision between two worldviews. On one side stood the Teutonic Knights, a militant monastic order armored in Crusader ideology. They saw themselves as God's sword, bringing Christianity to the pagan East. But by 1410, their holy war was unraveling. Their enemies were no longer scattered tribes, they were nations. Facing them was a rare alliance, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Christian and pagan, Western and Eastern, royal bloodlines tangled with tribal roots. It was messy, it was improvised, and it worked. The battle was brutal. Over 50,000 men clashed in hand-to-hand chaos. When the dust settled, the Teutonic order lay broken, their Grand Master dead, their myth of divine invincibility gone. Grunwald wasn't just a military victory. It was a system shift. The rigid, top-down Crusader model, loyal to Rome, blind to local realities, had collapsed. In its place rose a hybrid, adaptable, decentralized, cooperative, an early signal that the future would belong to those who could bend, not just those who could command. It's a lesson for every era. Dogma may march in shining armor, but resilience wears mismatched boots. From the forests of Grunwald, we now ride south to a sun-scorched plateau where cultures clashed, alliances fractured, and the forgotten war shaped the soul of a continent. The Spanish Reconquista. It wasn't just a battlefield. It was a reckoning. In the summer of 1212, three Christian kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, united in a rare moment of fragile cooperation. Their target, the mighty Almohad Caliphate, rulers of much of Iberia and guardians of centuries of Muslim civilization. At stake was more than land. It was memory, religion, and revenge. Las Navas de Tolosa, unfolded on a scorching plateau near the Sierra Morena. The Christians took the high ground, a tactical advantage that became symbolic. After years of retreat and fear, they were no longer on the defensive. But beneath the banners and steel was something deeper. Ancestral ghosts, generations of displacement, stories whispered in exile of cities lost, temples turned to mosques, names erased from maps. This wasn't about territory. It was about identity reclaimed. The Almohads had numbers, cavalry, and fortified camps, but the Christian coalition had desperation and betrayal in their favor. Local Muslim tribes, disillusioned with Almohad rule, opened mountain passes, allowing the Christian forces to strike where the enemy least expected. The result? A devastating breach. The heart of the Caliphate's army collapsed. Las Navas didn't end Muslim rule in Iberia, but it made it inevitable. What drives a people to fight for a land they haven't touched in generations? Sometimes it's faith, sometimes memory. Sometimes it's a longing so old it lives in the blood. From the mountains of Spain we head north again, to a place where rebellion brewed not in palaces, but in forests. There, the cry wasn't for conquest, it was for freedom. Battle of Bannockburn, 1314. The English thought it would be easy, just another rebellion to crush, another unruly province to discipline. But Bannockburn was no rebellion. It was resistance, raw, desperate, and brilliantly executed. In June of 1314, near a small stream outside Stirling, Robert the Bruce faced a vastly larger English force. He didn't have wealth, he didn't have numbers. What he had was ground and grit. The terrain was swampy, narrow, and choked with hidden ditches. Bruce forced the English into a bottleneck, breaking their cavalry's momentum and turning their size into a weakness. His soldiers weren't elite knights. They were farmers, woodsmen, men who knew the land better than they knew formal battle formations. But it wasn't just tactics. It was belief. Bruce didn't promise glory. He promised survival, a future without English boots on Scottish soil. His men weren't fighting for a king. They were fighting for home. When the English charge faltered, Scottish spears held firm. When the knights became trapped in the mire, the Scots pressed in. What began as resistance became rout. An empire recoiled, stunned by the power of those it thought beneath it. Bannockburn wasn't just a military win. It was a psychological fracture in the myth of empire. And today, it whispers to us still. Are we more like England, bloated, slow, assuming permanence? Or are we like those Scots, small, nimble, and dangerously underestimated? Next, we enter the furnace of the Holy Land, where pride, heat, and water scarcity broke the most arrogant force of them all. A desert lesson in humility. The Crusaders marched with banners high, convinced of divine favor. But the desert had no patience for arrogance. In July of 1187, near the twin peaks of Hatin in modern-day Israel, the Crusader army made a fatal mistake. Led by King Guy of Lusignan, they abandoned defensible positions to chase Saladin, the brilliant Muslim leader who knew the land, the heat, and the limits of human endurance. It was a trap. Saladin controlled the wells. He set fires to dry brush, turning the landscape into a furnace. The Crusaders, clad in chainmail, began to collapse, not from wounds, but from thirst. Their formations buckled, their horses died, their morale evaporated. By the time battle was joined, it was over. Surrounded, dehydrated, and exhausted, the Crusader force was annihilated. The true cross, their most sacred relic, was captured. Templar and Hospitaller knights were executed. King Guy was taken prisoner. But Hatin wasn't just a military disaster. It was an ideological rupture. The illusion of Christian supremacy in the Holy Land shattered. Saladin wasn't just a military genius. He was a strategist who used ecology, patience, and terrain as weapons. He didn't fight the Crusaders head-on. He let the land do it for him. This was colonizer arrogance meeting indigenous intelligence. And it asks a deeper question. In systems we don't fully understand, climate, culture, terrain, how often do we charge forward, blind? From the ashes of Hatin, we now return to a wider view across all these battlefields to ask what they really teach us, not about kings and swords, but about collapse, resilience, and how fragile even the strongest systems can be. Medieval battles reveal about collapse. Strip away the armor, silence the war drums. What remains? A battlefield is not just a graveyard of men, it's a graveyard of systems. Every clash we've seen, from Hastings to Hatin, tells the same story in different armor. When logistics fail, when leaders overreach, when the terrain is misunderstood, collapse is not a surprise, it's inevitable. These weren't just battles for crowns or banners. They were stress tests on entire civilizations. What held under pressure? What snapped? What broke so completely that history had to start over? And now, look around. Our food doesn't grow nearby. Our communication lines hum with complexity we barely understand. Our cities, like Constantinople, feel unbreachable until one disruptive force finds the weakness in the wall. Are we truly more advanced, or just more fragile in disguise? The knights fell because they trusted in armor. The kings fell because they trusted in permanence. The empires fell because they forgot how quickly hunger, heat, or hubris can undo a 1,000-year legacy. So here's the question no history book can answer, but every battlefield whispers. If everything collapsed tomorrow, would you know how to survive? Because once our ancestors did, in mud, in fire, with bows and grit. They didn't fight for power. They fought to protect the systems that kept their people alive. And in that smoke, there's one last lesson. The most dangerous myth isn't that we are doomed to repeat history. It's that we've outgrown it. Now ask yourself, do you know where your nearest water source is? Because someone in the past did, and they died for it.